quat, we gardena in gardagum. To modern ears, that sounds like a foreign language, but those heavy, rhythmic syllables are the earliest surviving ancestors of the very words we speak today. To see how those sounds arrived, we have to go back to the early 5th century. In 410 AD, the Roman military withdrew from Britain, leaving the population exposed. Germanic mercenaries crossed the sea from the continent to fill that sudden power vacuum. These arriving tribes brought their swords, their pagan gods, and a rich, entirely spoken culture. They did not read or write a single word of literature. Instead, they relied on a figure known as the scope or gleeman. These bards stood by the fire in wooden mead halls, striking a harp and performing violent, mythological war poetry to preserve their tribe's history. But breath is fragile. The moment a scope died, thousands of memorized lines risked erasure. These foundational myths survived only because they collided with an opposing worldview that possessed the technology to write them down. That opposing force arrived at the end of the 6th century in the form of Christian missionaries. Monks established stone abbeys across the island and began the painstaking work of transcribing local customs into ink and parchment. The survival rate for these early texts is staggeringly low. Almost every piece of Old English poetry we have today is contained in just 4 fragile handwritten books. This page from the Nowell Codex contains Beowulf, locking an oral tale into physical format. Poets built lines using a 4-stress system chained by heavy alliteration. They also used kennings, like combining bone and house into bonehouse. The monks transcribing these verses acted as active editors. They layered their own Christian theology directly over the original Germanic warrior code, inserting references to a single creator into tales of blood feuds and monsters. By merging pagan violence with monastic scholarship, these scribes built the first permanent physical architecture of the English literary tradition. In the 9th century, that architecture was nearly burned to the ground. Danish Vikings invaded the English kingdoms, targeting and sacking the wealth-filled monasteries. The fires destroyed countless manuscripts. Across the island, Latin literacy, the bedrock of monastic education, collapsed as scholars fled or were killed. Facing the total loss of English learning, King Alfred of Wessex enacted a radical policy. He abandoned Latin as the sole language of education and elevated the native English tongue. Alfred gathered scholars to translate critical philosophical and historical texts directly into the West Saxon dialect. He shifted the literary focus away from complex, artistic verse and toward practical, straightforward prose. This page from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle shows the result of that policy. Alfred initiated this massive record-keeping project, creating a standardized, blocky English prose designed for recording national history year by year. Alfred's wartime pivot gave the English language practical utility, moving it from the mead hall into the machinery of the state. By the year 1000, England possessed a highly sophisticated literary ecosystem. Epic poetry, introspective elegies, and standardized historical prose were thriving. Then came the Norman Conquest of 1066. The common assumption is that when French-speaking elites took military and political control of the island, the Old English literary tradition was immediately wiped out. The manuscripts tell a different story. Monks continued copying English homiletic prose, sermons, and religious teachings well into the 1100s, keeping the syntax and vocabulary alive in the church. Even the older, alliterative poetic style survived. It went dormant in official court circles, only to resurface and flower again in the major poems of the 14th century. The tribes who crossed the sea in the 5th century carried a fragile oral tradition that could have vanished in a single generation. 600 years later, their language had evolved into an indestructible written bedrock. This period provided the structural template that allowed the English language to survive 2 distinct foreign conquests and retain its essential character.